A top U.S. naval commander visits China to defuse conflict on the high seas. Is it a good start? We'll ask our two panelists right after this. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. Although tensions exist between China and the U.S., the two sides are actively talking to each other recently. Following last week's trade talks, the American Chief of Naval Operations met with his Chinese counterpart in Beijing on Monday. Admiral John Richardson said his talk with Vice Admiral Shen Jinlong was constructive and ongoing. According to the U.S. Navy statement, Richardson will also visit Nanjing during his 4-day visit to China. The South China Sea remains a big area of contention between the two countries. In September last year, two destroyers from the two countries nearly collided in the waters, sending jitters over a full naval conflict. Last Monday, China's foreign ministry protested the sailing of a U.S. warship near the Xisha Islands and warned that China will stick with measures to safeguard national sovereignty and security. For more on military relations between China and the U.S., let's turn to our panelist here in Beijing studio, Mr. Zhang Zhenzhe, who is a senior captain and vice president of the Naval Research Institute of China. And we are hoping to be joined later by one of your colleagues coming from the United States. Oh, there we go. We got Richard White, senior fellow from the Hudson Institute. Mr. White, welcome to the program as well. Mr. White, let me go to you first, possibly, if I can. How is the American side looking at the possible result of this so-called one of those frequent exchanges?
Modestly. I mean,
okay.
I think that the Secretary's office gave a statement saying they just thought it was important to continue dialogue, discuss possible future cooperation, discuss recent developments, manage frictions. I mean, there's a limit to what even the Secretary of one of the armed services can do given the overall state of the relationship. So there's no indication they're going to sign any important agreement. They'll probably talk maybe about the U.S. Navy participating in the anniversary of the parade of the Chinese Navy in a couple months. I think it's April. Possible Chinese return to RIMPAC, issues related to the South China Sea, and so on. But no breakthroughs are expected.
Well, those are already quite dramatic issues, I would say. The participation of both sides into each other's military exercises, and China going back to the RIMPAC. Remember, China was not necessarily there, 2018, and also even about the South China Sea issue. Let's go to our Chinese guest, Mr. Zhang, Senior Captain Zhang. What do you make from China's perspective? What can be expected?
Well, from the statement made by Admiral John Richardson before he came to China, we can see that his visit, the aim of his visit is to strengthen the strategic communication between the two sides and reduce the possible maritime security risks, and in the end, to avoid conflicts at sea. He says during his statement that honest and also frank dialogue will improve the relationship in a constructive way. I think it is true, and I fully agree with Admiral Richardson. I think his visit demonstrates the common will of both sides to manage and control the maritime security risk. And I think this is in the common interest of both countries.
Having said that, though, the two sides, remember, it was the trade that used to be termed as the so-called stabilizing factor of the bilateral relations. Of course, recently it ran into a little problem, to say the least. And now both sides all agree that possibly the military ties could be the stabilizing factor of the relations between the two countries. But Mr. White, obviously this statement is being made on a very different nature, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, if you look at the history of the relationship, for a while the military ties were lagging. I mean, they were good in the 1980s, but then in the 1990s, they withered. And at the same time, China-U.S. trade, academic exchanges, and so on have been increasing significantly. When President Xi came to power, he apparently made a decision that the Chinese military and the U.S. military had to maintain the dialogue despite tensions over some of the other issues we've talked about in this program, you know, Taiwan, Korea, and so on. And since then, that relationship's been pretty solid. As you mentioned, the U.S. Has canceled China's participation in earlier RIMPAC exercises. China sometimes denied U.S. ships access to Hong Kong or other. There's been minor issues, but it's not like it was during the 1990s when if China was upset, for example, at a U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, it would just shut down the relationship for years. So President Xi and President Trump have committed to keeping the dialogue open, but there's a limit to what it can do. I mean, if we're in this, if we're in this major trade dispute, we've got disputes over people being held in U.S. custody. And what's going on in China's domestic affairs and other regional security issues. Even if the military dialogue continues, it's the most we could hope is that it helps manage any potential clashes that neither side wants. We obviously don't want a war, and so that can help. But it's hard for me to see even how a good military dialogue will benefit the overall relationship in the absence of some kind of agreement, particularly on the economic issues.
Right. Captain Zhang, Senior Captain Zhang, I want to go to you about that. Also about the nature of the military interactions these days. Even though we see quite somewhat frequent compared to other sectors of U.S.-China relations exchanges in the military. But this is all about the bottom line, isn't it? This is about what the least the two sides have to do in order to avoid a whole-scale confrontation, isn't it, the Senior Captain Zhang?
Yes, sure. I think the military-to-military relationship is an important part of the overall relationship between the two countries. And for previous years, we have been saying that the trade relationship between the two countries is a stabilizer in our relationship. But now we have seen that Mr. Trump has launched trade frictions against China. So the trade frictions are also now up and down. So I think at this time, both sides, especially the two militaries, realize that if the two militaries collide with each other, or we launched conflicts or cause conflicts at sea, this will be disaster for both countries. So we have to control the possible risks between our countries.
But how to control the possible risks? Probably that is a crucial question to be asked. If you think about the two jets almost flying toward in a very close distance to one another, and also earlier the U.S. ships coming into the area which China claims as its own territory, and also could not stand any foreign intrusion as a result. So, Senior Captain Zhang, have the two sides come up with efficient amount of bottom line setting that further possible military conflict or crisis can be really avoided, Senior Captain Zhang?
Well, first, I think dialogues, exchanges, and are the best ways for us to proceed with our relationship. And also we can explore the possible areas where we can cooperate. This is what Admiral Richardson says in his statement. I think both sides are now first to reduce the possible risks and manage and control the risks. Second, we are looking for possible areas that we can cooperate, and in this way we can strengthen the strategic trust between the two sides. I think this is the first steps. And third, I think both sides should respect each other's core interests and security concerns.
Okay. Mr. White, though, what are some of the specific bottom lines that the two sides have been working together? Have they been really successful?
Well, we've got this, as you correctly mentioned in your previous comments, we've got what's happening is the U.S., the Chinese Navy and Air Force has been expanding its capabilities, expanding its operations. And so in previous decades, the Chinese government was just as opposed to these U.S. freedom of navigation operations or other activities, but they really couldn't do anything about it. Now, with a large number of forces in proximity, it becomes much more of an issue. How do we manage those kinds of close encounters? And that's something that is normally left to the military, so they can develop rules of the road. You know, if two of our ships are approaching, they both turn right, something like that. Communication channels, expanded dialogue. I understand the Admiral's going to Nanjing as well as Beijing, so that will give him an opportunity to talk to the Chinese command there. So they can do, I mean, we certainly don't want to get into a conflict that's dragged by an accident, which we've had in the past, as you mentioned, you know, of collisions or plane crashes and so on. But I mean, overall, the relationship it's going to be difficult to manage beyond just the military to military. It's really, you've got to deal with economic issues. They may want to discuss some Korea, Afghanistan, a couple other regional issues, so I haven't seen any indication that they will. So I think they'll just focus on the mill-to-mill managing ties and potential proximity encounters.
Just to be pragmatic here, I mean, we all understand what's happening between the two countries' relations over the past year and two. So, Senior Captain Zhang, the reasonable question to be asked, even during the Cold War between the former Soviet Union and also the United States, some specific basic rules have been set between those two countries. Of course, China and the U.S. now is not in a Cold War, but certainly in a transition of relations. Senior Captain Zhang, how important is it to be able to work out these bottom lines and these agreements to avoid crisis as soon as possible through efficient discussions so that there will be no misunderstanding when any side is taking risks toward the others?
Well, first, in recent years, China and the United States, especially the two navies, have worked out some regulations, rules. For instance, the ROB, the rules of behavior for the naval encounters at sea and air, that would prohibit the possible encounters or contacts between the close contacts between the two sides and avoid possible misunderstanding. And also we have the multilateral rule we call the CUES, the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea. This will avoid misunderstanding at high seas. But the question here is that the United States keeps sending its warships into the territorial seas of China, especially in the Xisha Islands and also the adjacent waters of the islands and reefs in the Nansha Islands. This is the main problem. In this way, China will absolutely send its warships to monitor and to drive the U.S. ships out of our territorial seas. So we cannot find any clause in the international law, including the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, that can allow the United States send its warships to maneuver, to exercise maneuver inside China's territorial sea. So this is the root cause of possible conflicts between the two sides. If the United States reduce or stop such kind of freedom of navigation operations inside China's territorial seas, everything, I think, will be okay.
We are very clear about the statements coming from both sides regarding their stance. Before we go, 20 seconds for both of you. What do you think could be the pragmatic achievement, if there is any, about this visit and exchange? Mr. Weitz, very briefly.
Well, I think just keeping the dialogue going is an achievement. I forgot to mention, I think the Chinese may want to understand U.S. policy now that Secretary Mattis has left. I mean, we have a new Secretary of Defense, and that will probably also be discussed.
Okay, Senior Captain Zhang, 20 seconds.
Well, I think dialogues between the two sides is good for us to enhance the mutual understanding between two sides. And I think during his visit, we'll exchange our concerns on many issues, including the issue in the South China Sea.
All right, Senior Captain Zhang Junshi, Mr. Richard White, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.